Captain Robert Hayes had seen it all in his 18 years of flying commercial planes. Storms that made grown men cry, engine failures that would test anyone's nerves, and passengers who ranged from delightful to downright difficult. But as he walked through the first-class cabin of Flight 847 from New York to Dubai, something caught his attention that made him pause. The man in seat 2A was on his phone, speaking rapidly in what sounded like Arabic. Robert couldn't understand a single word, but the passenger's tone was sharp and urgent. His free hand moved constantly as he talked, pointing at something on his laptop screen, then gesturing in the air like he was trying to convince someone of something important. Robert had learned to notice things during his years in aviation. After everything that had happened in the world, pilots were trained to watch for unusual behavior. This wasn't paranoia. It was part of keeping hundreds of people safe at 35,000 feet. And right now, his gut was telling him something wasn't right. The passenger looked to be in his early 40s, well-dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His boarding pass showed his name as Ahmed Al-Mansouri, and according to the passenger manifest, he was some kind of technology executive. Rich guy, flying first class to Dubai, nothing unusual there. But the way he was talking on that phone call made Robert's trained instincts kick in. Ahmed's voice rose slightly as he continued his conversation. He was leaning forward now, his body language tense and focused. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a normal business call. The words came fast and clipped, like he was giving instructions or maybe arguing with someone. Every few seconds, Ahmed would glance around the cabin as if checking to see who might be listening. Robert tried to convince himself he was overreacting. Maybe this guy was just passionate about his business. Maybe he always talked with his hands. Maybe the language barrier was making everything seem more dramatic than it actually was. But 18 years of flying had taught him that when something felt off, it usually was. The flight attendant came by to ask Ahmed to end his call for takeoff. Ahmed held up one finger, the universal sign for just one more minute, and continued talking. His voice got even more urgent, like he was running out of time to say something important. Robert watched as Ahmed typed something quickly on his laptop, then turned the screen toward his phone camera, showing whoever he was talking to something on the display. Finally, Ahmed ended the call and put his phone in airplane mode. But instead of relaxing, he immediately opened his laptop and started typing furiously. Robert could see him from where he stood, and the man's fingers were flying across the keyboard like his life depended on getting this message sent before they lost internet connection. Robert made his way back to the cockpit, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. In his training, they'd been told to watch for passengers who seemed nervous, agitated, or who were having suspicious conversations. Ahmed checked at least 2 of those boxes. The captain knew he had a choice to make, and the safety of 312 passengers was in his hands. As Flight 847 pushed back from the gate, Robert went through his pre-flight routine, but his mind kept drifting to seat 2A. He'd seen plenty of business, travelers making last-minute deals, closing important contracts, or handling urgent company matters. This felt different. The intensity in Ahmed's voice, the way he'd gestured at his laptop screen, the urgent typing afterward, it all added up to something that made Robert uncomfortable. The plane climbed into the evening sky, the lights of New York falling away, below them. Robert had made hundreds of flights to Dubai, and most were routine. Passengers would eat their meals, watch movies, sleep, and wake up in a different part of the world. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he had a passenger who was making him second-guess everything. About an hour into the flight, Robert decided to take another walk through the cabin. He told his co-pilot he wanted to check on the passengers, something he did regularly, anyway. But really, he wanted another look at Ahmed Al-Mansouri. What he saw made his concerns grow stronger. Ahmed was back on his phone, this time using the plane's Wi-Fi for what looked like a video call. His laptop was open beside him, and he was pointing at the screen while talking rapidly in Arabic. The conversation looked even more intense than the one before takeoff. Ahmed's face was serious, almost worried, and he kept checking his watch like he was running out of time for something. Robert stood near the galley, pretending to check on the flight attendants while keeping an eye on Ahmed. The man was clearly in some kind of heated discussion. His voice carried just enough for Robert to hear the urgency in it, even though he couldn't understand the words. At one point, Ahmed actually stood up from his seat while still on the video call, pacing the small area in front of his seat like he was too worked up to sit still. This wasn't normal passenger behavior. Robert had seen people make important business calls during flights, but this was something else entirely. The body language, the urgency, the way Ahmed kept looking around the cabin while he talked, it all screamed that something significant was happening. Robert returned to the cockpit with a decision forming in his mind. He couldn't ignore what he was seeing. His job wasn't just to fly the plane from point A to point B. His job was to ensure the safety of everyone on board. And right now, his experience and training were telling him that the passenger in seat 2A needed to be watched carefully. The captain pulled out the communication device that connected him to ground control. He had the power to alert authorities about suspicious passenger behavior. It was a decision that could have serious consequences for Ahmed al-Mansouri, but Robert felt he had no choice. The safety of 312 people had to come first. As he prepared to make the call that would change everything, Robert had no idea that his assumptions were about to be challenged in ways he never could have imagined. Sometimes, the most important lessons come from the moments when we're forced to question everything we think we know. Captain Robert Hayes couldn't concentrate on his usual flight duties. Every few minutes, his thoughts drifted back to the passenger in seat 2A. 3 hours into the flight to Dubai, and Ahmed al-Mansouri was still making those intense phone calls. Robert had walked through the cabin twice more, and each time the scene was the same. Urgent conversations in Arabic, constant gesturing at his laptop screen, and that worried expression that never seemed to leave his face. Robert's co-pilot, David Chen, noticed his captain's distraction. David had been flying with Robert for 2 years and had never seen him this focused on a single passenger. Usually, Robert was calm and methodical, handling whatever came up with the steady confidence that made him one of the airline's most trusted pilots. Tonight was different. "Everything okay, Captain?" David asked during a quiet moment as they flew over the Atlantic. Robert paused before answering. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "That passenger in 2A," he said quietly, "been watching him for the past few hours. Something about his behavior doesn't sit right with me." David had heard about Ahmed's phone calls from the flight attendants. Apparently, the man had been making video calls almost non-stop since they reached cruising altitude. The crew had mentioned it because it was unusual. Most passengers used flight time to sleep or relax, not conduct intensive business meetings. "What exactly is concerning you?" David asked, keeping his voice low. Robert chose his words carefully. "It's the way he's communicating. Very intense, very urgent. All in Arabic, lots of hand gestures, constantly showing things on his computer screen. He looks stressed, maybe even agitated. In our line of work, you learn to notice when someone's behavior pattern doesn't match normal passenger activity." The captain had seen thousands of business travelers over the years. He knew what normal looked like: executives catching up, on emails, making routine calls to their offices, preparing for meetings. What he was seeing from Ahmed felt different, more urgent, more secretive. The passenger kept looking around while he talked, like he was worried about being overheard. Robert made his decision. He called the lead flight attendant, Tony Rodriguez, to the cockpit. Tony had been working international flights for 12 years and had developed good instincts about passenger behavior. If anyone could give Robert a second opinion, it would be Tony. "I need your honest assessment of the passenger in 2A, Robert said when Tony arrived. "Have you noticed anything unusual about his behavior?" Tony nodded immediately. "Actually, yes. He's been on video calls almost constantly since we reached cruising altitude. Very animated conversations, all in Arabic. The other passengers in first class have started to notice because he's been talking pretty loudly. Not angry loud, but intense loud, if you know what I mean." "Has he made any requests, asked about anything unusual?" "Nothing out of the ordinary. Asked for coffee a couple times, requested a meal change, pretty normal stuff. But the phone calls are definitely not typical passenger behavior. Most people use flight time to disconnect, you know. This guy seems to be in crisis mode about something. Robert felt his concerns were justified. Two experienced aviation professionals were noticing the same unusual patterns. In the post-911 world, unusual passenger behavior couldn't be ignored, even if it made him uncomfortable to single someone out. "Here's what I'm thinking," Robert said. "I want to alert ground control about a passenger of interest. Not an emergency, but someone who should be monitored when we land. His behavior pattern is concerning enough that I think authorities should be aware." Tony understood the gravity of what Robert was saying. Reporting a passenger as suspicious would create a paper trail that could affect that person's ability to travel in the future. It wasn't a decision any crew member took lightly, but passenger safety had to come first. "You want me to document his behavior for the report?" Tony asked. "Yes. Keep it factual. Times of phone calls, duration, general demeanor. Don't speculate about content since we can't understand what he's saying. Just document what we can observe." As Tony headed back to the cabin, Robert picked up the secure communication device that connected him directly to air traffic control and security coordination centers. This was a tool he'd hoped never to use, but 18 years of flying had taught him that when multiple crew members had the same concerns about a passenger, those concerns needed to be taken seriously. "Air traffic control, this is Emirates Flight 847, Captain Hayes speaking. I need to report a passenger of interest for security screening upon arrival in Dubai." The voice on the other end was professional and calm. "Copy that, Flight 847, please. Provide passenger details and nature of concern." Robert gave Ahmed's seat number, name from the manifest, and a careful description of the behavior patterns they'd observed. He was careful to stick to facts: the frequent phone calls, the animated discussions, the apparent urgency of whatever the passenger was discussing. He didn't mention that the conversations were in Arabic, knowing that language alone shouldn't be grounds for suspicion, but the overall pattern of behavior was concerning enough to warrant attention. "Understood, Flight 847. We'll have appropriate security personnel standing by upon your arrival. Continue normal flight operations and keep us informed of any changes in passenger behavior." Robert hung up the communication device with mixed feelings. He'd done what his training and experience told him was necessary, but he couldn't shake a nagging doubt about whether he was overreacting. What if Ahmed was just a passionate businessman dealing with an urgent corporate crisis? What if the intensity Robert was reading as suspicious was just cultural differences in how some people communicated? But then he thought about the 312 other passengers on his plane. Families traveling home, business people starting new ventures, tourists beginning their vacations. His primary responsibility was to all of them, and if there was even a small chance that one passenger posed a risk, he had to act. 2 hours later, as they flew over European airspace, Tony returned to the cockpit with his observations. Ahmed had made 6 more video calls, each lasting 15 to 20 minutes. The conversations continued to be intense, with lots of gesturing and occasional moments where Ahmed would stand up and pace while talking. He'd also been typing constantly on his laptop between calls, sometimes showing his screen to whoever he was talking to on video. "Any interaction with other passengers?" Robert asked. "None. He's been completely focused on his calls and his computer, barely touched his meal. When other passengers tried to make small talk during boarding, he was polite but brief. Since we've been in the air, he's been in his own world." Robert nodded. The behavior pattern was consistent with someone completely absorbed in some kind of urgent situation. Whether that situation was legitimate business or something more concerning, he couldn't tell. But the decision had been made, and security would sort it out on the ground. As Flight 847 continued its journey toward Dubai, Robert settled in for the remaining hours of flight time. He'd done what he thought was right, following protocols designed to keep everyone safe. What he didn't know was that his decision was about to collide with a truth that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the situation unfolding in Seat 2A. While Captain Robert Hayes was making his report to ground control, flight attendant Keisha Williams was serving drinks in the first-class cabin. Keisha had been working for the airline for 6 years, and she took pride in providing excellent service to passengers from all corners of the world. What most people didn't know about Keisha was that she spoke fluent Arabic, a skill she'd developed during her college years studying international relations and her 2-year stint teaching English in Morocco. As she moved through the cabin, Keisha couldn't help but overhear the conversations coming from seat 2A. Unlike her colleagues who only heard urgent tones and animated gestures, Keisha understood every single word that Ahmed al-Mansouri was saying, and what she heard was completely different from what everyone else was imagining. Ahmed wasn't planning anything dangerous or suspicious. He was desperately trying to save lives. During his first video call after takeoff, Keisha heard Ahmed talking to someone about water purification systems. He was explaining technical specifications, delivery schedules, and bureaucratic roadblocks that were preventing life-saving equipment from reaching people who desperately needed it. His urgency wasn't about conducting illegal business. It was about the fact that children were dying while paperwork sat on government desks. "The systems are ready," Ahmed had said in Arabic during one call. "We have 50 units that can purify water for 10,000 people each. But the Lebanese authorities are demanding additional permits that could take weeks to process. We don't have weeks." The refugee camp outside Beirut has had 3 children die from waterborne diseases just this week. Keisha had paused in her drink service, shocked by what she was hearing. This man wasn't a security threat. He was a humanitarian, trying to cut through red tape to deliver clean water to Syrian refugees. His company had apparently developed some kind of advanced water purification technology, and he was using his wealth and connections to get it to people who needed it most. The second call was even more revealing. Ahmed was talking to someone at the United Nations pleading for help with expedition procedures. "I understand you have protocols," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "But while we follow protocols, mothers are watching their babies get sick from contaminated water. My technology can help them right now, today, if we can just get past these bureaucratic barriers." Keisha continued her service duties while listening to conversation after conversation about delivery logistics, government approvals, and coordination with relief organizations. Ahmed was working with multiple humanitarian groups, trying to get water purification systems to 3 different refugee camps across the Middle East. His laptop screen, which the captain had seen him pointing to repeatedly, was showing maps of refugee settlements, technical specifications of his water systems, and deployment schedules. The more Keisha listened, the more frustrated she became, not with Ahmed, but with the situation developing around him. She'd noticed Captain Hayes and Tony Rodriguez paying close attention to Ahmed during their walks through the cabin. She'd seen their serious expressions and hushed conversations. It was becoming clear that Ahmed's passionate humanitarian work was being misinterpreted as suspicious behavior. During Ahmed's 4th call, Keisha heard him talking to his company's logistics coordinator in Dubai. "The Dubai shipment needs to be loaded on trucks immediately when I land," he said. "We have a narrow window to get these systems across the border into Jordan before the weekend bureaucracy shutdown. Every day we delay means more families drinking contaminated water." Ahmed's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I got a message from the camp director this morning. They've had to move the children's section away from the main water source because the contamination levels are getting worse. These aren't just statistics, Hassan. These are real families, real children who could be drinking clean water tomorrow if we can just get these systems delivered." Keisha felt her heart breaking as she listened to Ahmed describe the conditions in the refugee camps. His wealth could have bought him a life of luxury and comfort, but instead he was using his resources and technology to help some of the world's most vulnerable people. The intensity that was making the flight crew suspicious was actually the passion of someone fighting against time and bureaucracy to save lives. When she saw Tony Rodriguez taking notes about Ahmed's behavior, Keisha realized she had to do something. The man in seat 2A was about to become the victim of a terrible misunderstanding that could destroy his reputation and potentially interfere with his humanitarian mission. Hundreds, maybe thousands of refugees were depending on Ahmed getting his water systems delivered, and security delays could derail everything. But speaking up would be risky. Flight attendants weren't supposed to eavesdrop on passenger conversations, even when they happened to understand the language being spoken. Challenging the captain's judgment about passenger safety was a serious matter that could affect her career. The airline industry had strict hierarchies, and questioning a captain's decision was not taken lightly. Keisha found herself in an impossible situation. She had information that could prevent a serious injustice, but sharing that information would require admitting she'd been listening to private conversations and would involve contradicting her captain's security assessment. In the aviation world, security concerns always took precedence, and crews were trained to err on the side of caution. As she watched Ahmed make another call, this one to a relief organization coordinator who was updating him on conditions at a refugee camp in Jordan, Keisha knew she couldn't stay silent. The man was describing the successful installation of 2 water purification units at another camp, explaining how child mortality rates had dropped dramatically once clean water became available. He was crying quietly as he listened to a report about families who no longer had to choose between letting their children drink contaminated water or go thirsty. Ahmed ended that call and immediately started typing an email, probably updating other members of his humanitarian team about the conversation. His suspicious laptop activity was actually coordination between relief organizations, government liaisons, and logistics teams all working together to deliver clean water to people who desperately needed it. Keisha made her decision. She couldn't let an innocent man be detained and possibly labeled as a security threat when his only crime was caring enough about suffering refugees to work around the clock to help them. The safety of Ahmed's humanitarian mission, and the hundreds of families depending on it, was more important than following typical protocol. She needed to find a way to share what she knew without getting herself in trouble or compromising passenger privacy. But first, she had to figure out how to approach Captain Hayes about a situation that could challenge everything he thought he knew about the passenger in seat 2A. The next few hours of the flight would determine whether Ahmed al-Mansouri would be able to complete his humanitarian mission or become another victim of post-911 security culture that sometimes saw threats where none existed. Keisha Williams spent the next hour wrestling with one of the most difficult decisions of her career. Every time she walked past seat 2A and heard Ahmed al-Mansouri's continued conversations about refugee camps and water systems, she felt the weight of what she knew pressing down on her. The man who her captain suspected of suspicious behavior was actually racing against time to save children's lives. The breaking point came when Keisha overheard Ahmed's most emotional call yet. He was talking to a doctor at a refugee camp outside Damascus, and the conversation was heartbreaking. The doctor was describing how they'd lost another child to cholera the previous night, a preventable death that could have been avoided with clean water. Ahmed's voice was thick with emotion as he promised the doctor that his water purification systems would be delivered within days, not weeks. "Dr. Khalil, I understand your frustration," Ahmed said in Arabic, tears visible in his eyes. "These bureaucratic delays are killing people, and I take full responsibility for not moving faster. But I promise you, by this weekend your camp will have clean water. I'm personally guaranteeing it." When the call ended, Ahmed sat quietly for several minutes, staring out the airplane window with the weight of responsibility clearly visible on his face. Keisha realized that his intense phone calls and urgent demeanor weren't signs of suspicious activity. They were the natural response of someone who felt personally responsible for solving a humanitarian crisis. That's when Keisha noticed Tony Rodriguez walking toward the cockpit with a notebook in his hand. She knew he'd been documenting Ahmed's behavior for the security report, and she couldn't let this misunderstanding continue any longer. Children were depending on Ahmed completing his mission, and a security delay could derail everything. Taking a deep breath, Keisha made a decision that went against every protocol she'd been taught. She followed Tony to the cockpit and asked to speak with Captain Hayes privately. This was highly unusual. Flight attendants typically went through the lead flight attendant for any communication with the captain, especially regarding passenger issues. "Captain Hayes," Keisha said respectfully, "I need to speak with you about the passenger in seat 2A. I have information that I think you need to hear." Robert looked surprised. In his years of flying, crew members rarely approached him directly about passenger concerns, especially when he'd already made a security assessment. What kind of information, Keisha? Sir, I speak fluent Arabic. I've been understanding Mr. Al-Mansouri's phone conversations throughout the flight, and I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding about the nature of his activities. The cockpit went silent. Robert hadn't known that any of his crew members spoke Arabic, and the revelation that someone had been understanding Ahmed's conversations completely changed the dynamic of the situation. You've been listening to his calls? Not intentionally listening, sir, but I couldn't help but understand them as I perform my duties in the cabin. And what I've heard is that Mr. Al-Mansouri is coordinating a humanitarian relief operation. He's trying to deliver water purification systems to Syrian refugee camps. His urgent phone calls have been with relief organizations, UN coordinators, and government officials trying to expedite permits for life-saving equipment. Robert felt the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he'd interpreted as suspicious behavior suddenly had a completely different explanation. Are you certain about this? Absolutely certain, sir. I heard him talking to doctors at refugee camps describing how children are dying from waterborne diseases, while his water purification technology sits in warehouses waiting for bureaucratic approvals. His company has developed systems that can provide clean water for thousands of people, and he's been working around the clock to get them delivered. David Chen, the co-pilot, looked between Robert and Keisha with growing understanding. So all that urgent activity we've been observing was a man trying to save children's lives. Keisha finished. He's been coordinating with multiple humanitarian organizations, dealing with government red tape and managing logistics for delivering clean water systems to 3 different refugee camps. The reason he seems so stressed and urgent is because people are literally dying while he fights bureaucracy. Robert felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He'd already reported Ahmed as a suspicious passenger to ground control. Security would be waiting when they landed in Dubai, ready to detain and question a man whose only crime was caring enough about suffering refugees to work tirelessly to help them. Keisha, I need you to tell me exactly what you've heard, Robert said quietly. I've already made a security report about Mr. Al-Mansouri, and if I've made a mistake, I need to understand the full scope of that mistake. For the next 20 minutes, Keisha detailed the conversations she'd overheard. She described Ahmed's coordination with the United Nations, his work with various relief organizations, his company's water purification technology, and his personal commitment to getting clean water to refugee families. She explained how his apparent agitation was actually frustration with bureaucratic delays that were costing lives. One of his calls was with a camp doctor who told him they'd lost a child to cholera last night. Keisha said. Mr. Al-Mansouri was crying during that conversation. These aren't business calls. They're emergency coordination calls for a humanitarian crisis. Robert realized the magnitude of his error. His training had taught him to watch for suspicious behavior, but it hadn't taught him to distinguish between the urgency of criminal activity and the urgency of humanitarian work. Both could look the same from the outside, especially when language barriers prevented understanding the actual content of conversations. What's his timeline for this relief operation? Robert asked. He needs to land in Dubai, coordinate the loading of water systems onto trucks and get them across borders into Jordan and Lebanon before government offices close for the weekend. Every hour of delay means more families drinking contaminated water. If security detains him for questioning, it could derail the entire operation. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Robert's shoulders. Not only had he potentially criminalized an innocent man, but his mistake could interfere with a mission to save children's lives. The very urgency that had made him suspicious was actually the urgency of someone fighting to deliver life-saving aid to people who desperately needed it. I have to contact ground control and correct my report, Robert said. But this is going to be complicated. Once a security alert has been filed, it's not easy to simply cancel it. Keisha nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Captain, would it help if you could verify what I'm telling you? Mr. Al-Mansouri has been showing documents and maps on his laptop during his video calls. If you approached him directly and explained the situation, he could probably provide documentation of his humanitarian work. Robert knew that approaching Ahmed directly would require admitting that the flight crew had been suspicious of him, which would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. but it was the only way to verify Keisha's account and potentially prevent a serious injustice. I think we need to have a conversation with Mr. Al-Mansouri, Robert decided. If what you're telling me is accurate, then I owe him an apology and need to do everything I can to ensure his humanitarian mission isn't delayed by my mistake. As they prepared to approach Ahmed, none of them could have predicted how profoundly this conversation would change everyone involved. Captain Robert Hayes had faced many difficult moments during his flying career, but walking down the aisle toward Seat 2A felt like one of the hardest things he'd ever had to do. Beside him, Keisha Williams served as both translator and witness to what was about to become a profound lesson in the dangers of assumption. Ahmed Al-Mansouri was in the middle of another video call when they approached, this time speaking with someone about truck convoy schedules and border crossing permits. When he saw the captain and flight attendant standing beside his seat, he immediately ended his call and looked up with concern. Mr. Al-Mansouri, Robert began, his voice careful and respectful. I'm Captain Hayes. I need to speak with you about something important, and I believe I owe you an apology. Ahmed's expression shifted from concern to confusion. He'd been so focused on his relief coordination that he hadn't noticed the flight crew's attention throughout the flight. Is there a problem with the flight, Captain? No, sir. The problem is with my judgment, Robert said, the words difficult to get out. I've been observing your phone conversations and urgent demeanor during the flight, and I reported you as a passenger of interest to security. I now believe I made a serious mistake based on incomplete information. The color drained from Ahmed's face as he realized what this meant. You reported me to security? For making phone calls? Keisha stepped forward, speaking in Arabic to help bridge the communication gap. She explained to Ahmed that she had overheard his conversations about the refugee camps and water purification systems, and that she had informed the captain about the true nature of his urgent business. Ahmed's expression shifted from shock to hurt to frustration as he processed what had happened. Captain Hayes, he said in English, I'm trying to save children's lives. Every minute we waste on misunderstandings is time that families in refugee camps don't have. I understand that now, and I take full responsibility for my error, Robert said. Can you help me understand your operation so I can contact ground control and correct my report? Ahmed opened his laptop and began showing them the documentation of his humanitarian work. The screen displayed maps of refugee camps, technical specifications for water purification systems, correspondence with the United Nations, and coordination schedules with various relief organizations. It was an impressive operation that represented months of planning and significant financial investment. My company developed these water purification systems for disaster relief, Ahmed explained, pointing to technical diagrams on his screen. Each unit can provide clean water for up to 10,000 people. We have systems ready for deployment to 3 refugee camps, but bureaucratic delays have been preventing delivery while children are literally dying from preventable diseases. He showed them photos from recent visits to the camps, heartbreaking images of families living in desperate conditions, children playing near contaminated water sources, mothers carrying water in whatever containers they could find. This isn't theoretical humanitarian work, Ahmed said, his voice thick with emotion. These are real people, real children who could have clean water tomorrow if we can just get past the red tape. Keisha translated some of the Arabic documents on Ahmed's screen, confirming coordination with multiple international relief organizations. The evidence was overwhelming. Ahmed wasn't just some wealthy businessman doing charity work on the side. He was running a sophisticated humanitarian operation that could significantly improve living conditions for thousands of refugees. The call you observed me making when you first walked through the cabin, Ahmed continued, was with a doctor at a camp outside Beirut. He was telling me about a 3-year-old girl who died from cholera 2 nights ago. That's why I seemed agitated. That's why I can't sit still. Every day we delay means more preventable deaths. Robert felt the full weight of his mistake settling on him. Not only had he wrongly suspected an innocent man, but his security report could potentially interfere with a mission to save lives. The urgency he'd interpreted as suspicious was actually the natural response of someone carrying the weight of humanitarian responsibility. Mr. Al-Mansouri, I need to contact ground control immediately and correct my report, Robert said. But I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to ensure there are no delays when we land. Your mission is too important to be derailed by my error in judgment. Ahmed's expression softened slightly as he saw the genuine remorse in the captain's eyes. Captain Hayes, I understand that you were trying to protect your passengers. In your position, I might have made the same assumptions. But I hope this situation can help people understand that urgency and passion aren't always signs of danger. Sometimes they're signs of someone trying desperately to help. Robert immediately contacted ground control using the cockpit communication system. Air traffic control. This is Captain Hayes on Emirates Flight 847. I need to correct and cancel my earlier security report regarding passenger Al-Mansouri. The passenger is conducting legitimate humanitarian relief operations, and no security. Screening is necessary upon arrival. The ground control response was professional but curious. Captain Hayes, can you confirm the nature of the passenger's activities? Confirmed. The passenger is coordinating water purification system deliveries to refugee camps through legitimate relief organizations. His urgent communications were related to life-saving humanitarian work, not security concerns. I request normal arrival procedures with no security delays. Copy that, Flight 847. Security screening canceled. Normal arrival procedures confirmed. With the security threat removed, Ahmed was able to focus on completing his mission preparation. He had trucks waiting at Dubai International Airport to load his water purification systems, and convoy coordinators standing by to transport them across borders into Jordan and Lebanon. Every hour saved could mean the difference between life and death for families in the refugee camps. As Flight 847 began its descent into Dubai, Robert reflected on the lesson he'd learned at 35,000 feet. His training had taught him to watch for suspicious behavior, but it hadn't taught him to distinguish between the urgency of criminal intent and the urgency of humanitarian compassion. Both could look identical from the outside, especially when cultural and language barriers prevented true understanding. The plane touched down in Dubai right on schedule. As passengers began collecting their belongings, Ahmed shook hands with both Robert and Keisha. "Thank you for listening," he said simply. "And thank you for being willing to admit a mistake and correct it. That kind of courage and integrity gives me hope for the world." 3 days later, Robert received an email with photos from the refugee camps where Ahmed's water purification systems had been installed. Children were playing near clean water sources, mothers were filling containers without fear, and camp medical officials reported a dramatic decrease in waterborne illnesses. The urgent phone calls that had made Robert suspicious had resulted in clean water for over 30,000 refugees. The incident became a turning point in Robert's career and personal growth. He began studying cultural awareness and implicit bias, eventually becoming an instructor who taught other pilots about the importance of context and communication in security assessments. Keisha's courage in speaking up despite protocol became a model for how crew members could challenge assumptions while maintaining safety standards. As for Ahmed, his water purification technology continued to serve refugee populations across the Middle East and Africa. But he never forgot the flight attendant who understood his words and the captain who had the courage to admit his mistake. Sometimes the most important conversations happen not on the ground, but in the space between assumption and understanding, where courage and compassion can change everything. The story spread quietly through aviation circles as a reminder that, in our interconnected world, the line between suspicious and humanitarian can be as thin as a language barrier, and the most important security tool might just be the willingness to listen and learn.